And I sent it to him.
How's everybody
We
doing?
sent it to whom we sent it to.
Everybody okay? I mean,
Okay.
this week we squeezed it in before another big snowstorm, right? So got lucky. Yeah, I just wanted to get going on time here. And before we actually get going with the presentation, I assume just about everybody in the room is familiar with DSVS. Anybody not familiar with DSVS? Well, I've been associated with DSVS for a very long, well, quite a while now. And at the moment, I'm the board chair of DSVS. And there's a DSVS sort of event that's just about to kick off here, right? So I thought we'd take a few minutes before we start the presentation and give the floor to Hayden, who works with DSVS, and Libby here is passing out some goodies to read. So Hayden, why don't you go through the
Thanks so much. It was really generous of Randy to give us a few moments of your time, and I appreciate you allowing us to interlope a little bit here on your education. I won't take much time since you know who we are. For anyone who might not, we're in our 23rd year of operation here in Stillwater, and as well as Carbon counties. We were founded in 1999 by Mitzi Voracek. And essentially, we serve clients who have faced interpersonal violence, includes domestic violence and sexual assault in their lives. We are ramping up for April. It's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So that's part of why we reached out to the community to see if anybody had some meetings. We could do just what I'm doing right now, just speak a little bit about sexual assault awareness, as well as sexual assault in our service area. And Randy was very generous, as always, to let me come and have a few minutes here. So just going to talk a little bit about sexual assault generally, and then what it looks like in our service area, as well as ways that you yourself can help in our community. A big part of interpersonal violence, part of why we talk about it as much as we can, is that silence is part of the cycle of violence that keeps it going. So the more we talk about these things, the more we believe and listen to the survivors in our lives, the better off our community is. Sexual assault encompasses a full range of experiences that people might have. We often think of rape, but there's a lot of other ways that it can affect our lives: harassment in the workplace, verbal harassment on the street. Pretty much almost every person we know might have been a victim of sexual assault. It can happen to anyone. It can happen anywhere, but we know that most people who experience sexual assault know their perpetrator. Up to 75% of victims know their perpetrator. It's also most likely to happen in or near their home. So those are some dynamics for us to think about. Sexual assault is about power and control. It's not about passion. So it's another means that people use to exert power and control over others. Kind of interesting to tie in current events that we're seeing. We all know that it is a huge factor in war as well. So in our service area, we help victims of sexual assault in a variety of ways. If someone chooses to report, or if not, is an extremely personal matter. There's kind of a knee-jerk reaction where the public assumes everyone should report all the time, but reporting a sexual assault is a very difficult process. Some survivors are able to pursue that option and some aren't, but we're here to fill in the gaps for all survivors. We listen to survivors. Our helpline is operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's staffed with volunteers who can help in emergency situations, as well as volunteers who can just be an active listener for victim survivors who need to share something they've been through. As community members, I think some of the main ways that we can help end the epidemic of sexual violence is to believe survivors in our lives. So many times when survivors speak up, they face judgment or not being believed. Part of judgment that I think it's hard for us to reconcile is our reaction. When somebody tells us about a sexual assault, we can have really strong reactions. And sometimes that can be read as negative or not believed. We might want to get angry, we might want to lash out at the perpetrator, but our ultimate goal is to support that survivor. And we're going to listen to them and listen to their response to what they've experienced. Another big thing that we can do to help is to end the culture, and rape culture, it's often called, but just end the culture of violence. Rape jokes are never fun. Our reaction to large media cases, cases that get a lot of attention in the media, can affect survivors in our lives. So if we say, oh, I don't believe that so-and-so had that experience, or they're just trying to get attention, the survivors in our lives can hear those things and they're not going to feel as ready or willing to share their experiences. So we want to believe and support everyone in their lives. Other things that DSVS does that I always like to promote, in Carbon and Stillwater counties, if someone experiences a sexual assault and they would like to get a SANE exam, which is the sexual assault nurse examination, also known as a rape kit, kind of colloquially, we provide free transportation in Carbon and Stillwater County to Billings Clinic, which is our closest hospital that will perform that exam. We do that in a collaborative effort with our local EMS. We've been doing it for years now, but I still think people might not know about it. So a survivor doesn't have to worry about how to get to Billings. We will handle that for them. Also, an advocate will stay with them throughout their exam. So I just want everybody to know about that in case it's ever something someone in your life might need. Libby passed out a little information on bystander intervention for you to read through. Really simple techniques. You don't have to be a superhero. It's as easy as asking someone if they're okay. That can be all it takes to come to be the difference in someone perpetrating a sexual assault. So I invite you to read that. She also passed out our safety cards. That 24-hour, 7-day-a-week helplines on there, as well as services in Yellowstone County and surrounding areas. And that's really my spiel. If you are ever interested in volunteering or going through some community training, we're going to have our next one in June. It's going to be a 4-day training with the first 2 days focused on kind of general concepts, and the last 2 days focused more on helpline skills. So we invite you all, and we'll post it on Facebook, so be on the lookout. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Hayes.
Appreciate it.
So thanks for that. So today we're going to cover only about 1,000 years. Shouldn't take too long. But before I kind of dive into the we got a little camera action going. I mean, the little windows. I wanted to put a book up here that I just discovered about 2 weeks ago. This book, and I've been reading a lot about Ukraine and all kinds of books, but this one is new, and like it says, it's a collection of essays by a whole bunch of different historians, authors, but they're all Ukrainian, and it's all recent. And I've only read about, I don't know, a third of it so far, and I've already uncovered insights about Ukrainians and their culture and how they think the way they do and how they think about government and all kinds of things that I have never seen or heard anywhere else. And although some of the essays are a little dense, some of them are absolutely not. But I just wanted to throw it up here. I can send you, I'll probably send an email out with how to get to it or take a look at it. I mean, it's published, it's on Amazon. You can get it on Kindle as well if you want it that way. But I'm finding it so insightful. I'm going to use so much of it in the 6th session, which is about nothing but Ukraine. Anyway, it's a great book. So we're going to basically kind of really dive into the 10th century here, when this thing called Russia is the kind of the origin story of, and you can see right out of the gate, this is the name Kievan Rus tells you immediately that Kiev is still the capital of Ukraine, right? And yet this is going to be the origin story of Russia and Ukraine. So the intertwining of these two cultures is going to be the theme throughout the whole deal. But before we dive into that, it'd be just a quick historical kind of refresher. Just the giant events that occurred before we talk about Russia's beginnings. Remember that 330 AD, Constantine, Roman emperor, converts to Christianity. And as the Roman Empire is falling apart, they abandon Rome and he establishes the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople, Istanbul today. And that is probably that's the most important thing that happens in early Russia's development, is the Eastern Orthodox Church is in the Byzantine Empire right south of Russia. Eventually the Roman Empire falls. And just as a historical note, Islam is founded, Prophet Muhammad about 610 AD. And then Charlemagne about 800 AD, just before we get into the Russian story, kind of creates the Holy Roman Empire post-Roman. And the world kind of looks like this. And you notice that there's like empires, right? There's the Frankish Empire, and the Bulgarian, but what you really should notice here is this whole part of the world, there's all it says is Western and Eastern Slavs. Well, okay, what is that? I mean, this is the Kievan Rus. This is the birthplace of Russia and Ukraine. But at this time, about 800 AD, it's just a collection of warring, pagan, illiterate Slavic tribes. Some of the Slavic tribes came down from Scandinavia as Vikings, their heritage. Some kind of came over from Bulgaria, and they're more kind of Slavic, the way we think of that word. And others came from sort of the precursors of the Turks, which is over here in the Volga River on the east side of things. But the point is they're just a bunch of completely disconnected tribes with no religion, no writing, and they're all fighting each other, but they're being surrounded by increasingly strong invasive empires. Okay, so in the middle of these empires is, now we're at the 10th century, this new collection of principalities, we'll call them, of the Kievan Rus. And there's this one prince, Prince Vladimir up here, who, I'll keep pushing these buttons wrong, is now, of course, known as Vladimir the Great. He's the one that unites all these diverse warring Slavic tribes in that area that you just saw on that other map. That are, and his heritage, his bloodline is the Rurik, which is their Viking. Their history is Viking. But a whole bunch of these are not Viking. But the person who puts this together as a unified sort of stop fighting each other. We're surrounded by empires, and if we don't get our act together, these empires are going to come into our part of the world and crush us, enslave us. He foresees the need to organize the Slavs. But he's a pagan. He's got 8 wives and 800 concubines. I think that counts as pagan. But one thing he observes, he's way ahead of his time in a lot of ways. He observes that these other empires, remember, we've got the Islamic states being organized in the south. And one thing that holds them all together is that they all have a monotheistic religion. Maybe it's Islam, maybe it's the Jewish tradition down south. Charlemagne has put back together the Roman Catholic, Western papacy is well underway now. And so Vladimir figures, well, if we're going to be a unified, I'll call it a state, we're way far away from this becoming a state yet. But he deduces that one of the things we need he needs 2 things. We need a religion, because we're pagans, and that seems to be, not the future. And he knows that there are these other religions surrounding him. So he decides that he has to find a solution. He goes shopping for a religion that is non-pagan. And he's got choices. He sends emissaries out to different parts of the empires around him to find out what is Islam, what is Western Catholicism. What is Judea? I mean, about, and because he's shopping, okay? He's trying to cut, he doesn't want to create his own religion. He wants to align with one that's part of one of these big empires. So let me just read sort of, but when his emissaries come back from visiting these empires, trying to understand what each one's religion is, this is kind of the report that he brings, that these emissaries bring back to Vladimir. So first the Muslims who are really in this whole eastern region here. Here's the report on the Muslims. Of the Muslim Bulgarians of the Volga, the envoys reported there is no gladness among them, only sorrow and a great stench. I'm just reading what he said, okay. He also reported that Islam is undesirable due to its taboo against alcoholic beverages and pork. And Vladimir's response is, well, drinking is the joy of all Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure. So cross Islam off. I think the Jewish representatives actually came up to visit him from Judea, and here's the report card on the Jews. Vladimir consulted with Jewish envoys and questioned them about their religion, but ultimately rejected it as well because saying that their loss of Jerusalem was evidence that they had been abandoned by God. So we don't want to hook up with them because their God is already, because by that time Jerusalem's fallen and they're scattered. So groups go to what we would think of as Germany, say today, in the Franco Empire under Charlemagne, and they didn't like the German side of it at all. The only thing they said was the churches of the Germans are dank and show no beauty. They were just, and they kind of are dank and rocks, and I mean, back then. But at Constantinople, which is here again, a city created by Constantine, the converted Roman emperor, and the seat of the Eastern Orthodox Church in the Byzantine Empire, everything there. Here's a report card on them. They went to Constantinople, where there was a full festival ritual by the Byzantine Church set in motion to impress the Kievan group. And then they found their ideal. We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or earth, they reported, describing the majesty of the divine liturgy, the huge cathedral that was in Constantinople at the time. So they went back to Vladimir and said, here's the answer. It's in Constantinople, and so that is how Vladimir selected the Byzantine Empire with their Eastern Orthodox Christianity as that was going to be the Kievan Rus official language. So remember, he's still a pagan, though. And, this is one of them. I mean, one of the, they still have gods of thunder and lightning. That's just one, the whole pantheon of these pagan gods. And this is kind of Vladimir after he converts. So here's I always have to put it up there because I can never pronounce this word. Hagia Sophia. And has anybody ever visited this in Istanbul? You've been there? Isn't it as mind-blowing as I hear? And as Vladimir thought it was?
You could just spend, if you had the time, hours.
Yeah.
absorbing.
Yeah, I mean, the interior, of course, it's a mosque now, which will, but at the time, of course, it was the seat of the Eastern Orthodoxy. So anyway, this was clearly why he chose what he chose. But again, he's not, he's a politician. He's trying to align himself with one of the empires. And the way that's always been done is you either marry off a daughter to a king or you marry a princess of the empire that you'd like to establish relationships with. And so he cuts a deal with the monarch of Constantinople. And he says, well, you know, I really want to marry that princess. And the monarch says of Constantinople, okay, well, you need to convert, you need to be baptized as a Christian, and you need to have all the Slavic tribes that you're organizing to convert to Christianity too. If you do that, you can marry the princess. And so he gets baptized, and he was in 988 AD, which is that's the date you always hear as the birth of Russia, is 988 AD, because now all the Slavic pagan Slavic principalities that we just looked at in the Kievan Rus are now being converted to, he demands and mandates that they all, and because he's made a deal here for the princess, right? Everybody's got to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy. And there was all the statues of the pagans come down, and he launches this effort to convert everybody and abandon paganism. Now, he's just committed to a religion, the Eastern Orthodox religion. And well, if you now have a religion, you certainly can't be illiterate anymore. Pretty soon you're going to have this thing called a Bible in somebody's hands, and they need to read it. They need to understand the liturgy in the church. The priests need, you need the major engine of literacy is you need a language. He doesn't have a language. He doesn't have any unified way to organize language, the alphabet, any of that around a single religion. There's 1,000 little dialects of Slavic tongues being spoken all around here. They all kind of have roots in Bulgaria here, but problem is he needs a religion. So at about time, he's trying to figure out, how do I get a new language, a liturgical language that we can build literacy and church going around. Well, let me go to the next thing here. The Byzantine emperor has already sent missionaries north from Constantinople to spread Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And these brothers, Cyril and Methodius, their task is to create this new language, which doesn't exist yet. Non-trivial thing. How do you create a language from what? And how do you teach it to all these tribes? So this is their task, and they do it. They create a language, and a lot of it is, and it's sort of this merging of the different parts of the old Slavic languages, Latin, Greek, and, well, you'll see in a minute, right? It's all over the place. So they create a new alphabet called the Gogolithic alphabet to start translating Christian texts into Slavic, in this new Slavic language. And because all the texts at the time, whether liturgical or anything in the Byzantine Empire, everything's in Greek, right? That's the language of that empire, and their heritage is Greek. But they knew right out of the gate, there's no way we're going to be able to take Greek to the Slavs. We need a language that will sound and feel right to the Slavic tongue and the Slavic way of thinking. So, and these two brothers create the language. Now, this is examples of it. This is the opening page of Corinthians in the Bible, translated from Greek into this brand new constructed language at the moment called Gogolithic. And here's gospel, that thing is still there. And that's the first book of John, I think that should be there. So this is the first attempt to create a liturgical language, a brand new one, translated from the Greek. This language is going to evolve, and it becomes known as Church Slavonic, which is really the first literary language for the Slavic tribes. I'm just going to keep calling them the Kievan Rus. And by the way, in case you're wondering, Rus, you'll probably think Rus, Russian. There must be some evolution of that term, the root, Rus. Actually, Rus in the Viking tongue means oarsman, right? So when you see that, I mean, that's kind of tells you that their heritage is Viking. Anyway, but little factoid. So this is now the next evolution of the language, which is going to, what we're going to do is just follow the evolution of the language into modern Russian. Now you're probably thinking, and if you watch Vladimir Lazinsky on TV from Ukraine speaking every day, he's speaking Ukrainian. And when he needs to, he speaks Russian if he's trying to reach the Russians. And of course, he speaks really good English. So you might be asking yourself, people ask me this, it's like, okay, so we're talking about the construction and evolution of the Russian language, the modern Russian language. How similar or dissimilar is it to Ukrainian? And they are very, very different. They started with these same roots way back in the 10th century, but they both went on different directions. And over time, Ukrainian became much more like Polish and Czech and Slovak, because, you know, for centuries, Ukraine was either occupied by the Poles, the Lithuanians, and their language evolved based on that. So, and Russian took another path completely separate from that. So I'm not gonna, but the thing is, in Ukraine today, Russian speakers cannot understand Ukrainian. I mean, they look and kind of sound the same, but unless the Russian speaker has actually gone to class, you probably can't understand Ukrainian spoken on the street. Where Ukrainians are almost universally bilingual. They can speak just like Zelensky. He could just move from Ukrainian to Russian effortlessly, as most people can, particularly in the big cities. In the big cities, most people actually on the street talk Russian in the Ukraine. In the rural areas, they almost exclusively talk Ukrainian. So if you're wondering about the identity of Ukrainians, it has nothing to do with language, right? Whether they're speaking Ukrainian and Russian, which are very different, but very similar in their origins. So anyway, I just wanted to try to get, because people always say, so it's like Russian, right? Yeah, but they don't, it's different, way different. So anyway, now this is today's modern Russian Cyrillic alphabet. Cyrillic, remember Cyril was one of the monks that, you know, dreamed up this thing. So if you just, this is what hooked me, you know, when I was in high school when I saw this, because I really like languages. And unfortunately now you're going to have to be victims of my liking languages. So look at that. Let's see what's going on with this Russian language. So we have letters that are familiar, that are drawn from the Latin. A is A, just like our A. Let's pick another one here. M, same as us. K is K. But what about that? Anybody want to guess? Now, if anybody used to be in a sorority or fraternity in college?
It's Greek.
It's Greek. What letter in Greek? You know, Gamma Delta Phi. I mean, I was never in a fraternity, okay, so I don't know, but what do you think that letter is in Greek?
Is it town?
Hmm?
Is it town?
No, it's a G, hard G, gamma.
Gamma.
It's gamma. It's gamma. So the sound is just like our hard G. Good, okay, but it's Greek. This letter, what do you think that is?
Lambda.
Lambda. That's lambda, and it's an L, and it sounds like an L, but it's pure Greek. And the last one, if we get down to these more exotic ones that are clearly not Latin or Greek, it's like, okay, what the hell is that? Let alone that. And where did it come from? And why did Cyril pick that letter to construct his new Russian alphabet, his Russian language? Well, let's go one little layer deeper and look at that letter. It's the sound phonetically of sh, sheep, sh, sh. And by the way, this one with the little tail is shush. It's, you know, the word for Russian soup, borscht? Those last four letters, sh, is all in this one letter, SHCH, borscht. All that is in that. It takes us two letters to say show. It takes them one letter to say. Okay, enough. Now, but the origin of that symbol, the SH, started, this is Phoenician, Babylonian, 2700 BC. That sound looked like this. Familiar? This is Aramaic. Aramaic is a Semitic language. Several of the Gospels are written in Aramaic. It was spoken in Egypt and whatever. But again, you see the sound is in Aramaic is the same thing. This is modern Hebrew for the same sound, same kind of thing. And this is Arabic for the same basic sound, phonetically of sh. So you can kind of see, if you like etymology, and you like to follow languages back to as far as you can find them, their origins, each one of those letters has a really cool story, if you're like this stuff. Okay, so that's one more thing. So one of you guys are going to pronounce this Russian word for me. So this is a Russian word, just a vocabulary word, using what we've just kind of learned. So, sh, remember I said A is just A, Latin, SH again, L, lambda. This thing is really silent. It's just there, but it's silent. And then K is K, like RK. Anybody want to pronounce that Russian word? Yeah, well, say it, speak up.
Shashlik.
Shashlik, right? You know what shashlik is? Shish kebab. Okay, that's the word for shish kebab. And it's like, well, that's interesting. The Russian starts with SH. Shish kebab starts with SH. Some connection there? I don't know. That's kind of weird, right? So, one more, I'll get you out of this in a minute. Turns out the word, the shish in shish kebab is the Turkish word for its skewer, the stick. Okay. Okay, so, but who actually coined the word shashlik as a shish kebab? Well, there's the Cossacks. You know the Cossacks? There were Don Cossacks and Zaporozhian Cossacks, and they were those military nomadic tribes that basically the Zaporozhian Cossacks became Ukrainians when they were nomadically roaming through the steppe and all the territory we think of Eurasia and today is Ukraine. So these are the Cossacks, wild and crazy guys, right? And this is my favorite Russian painting of all time. It shows the Zaporozhian Cossacks, say they're Ukrainians, but this is like the 13th, 14th century, writing a letter to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire just sent them a letter saying, demanding their surrender at this battle. The Sultan didn't know yet that his troops lost that battle. So these guys are writing a letter back to the Sultan saying, you know, take a hike. Anyway, but that's typical, you know. And the resurrection culturally of the Cossacks particularly these southern ones, not the northern ones, are really at the heart of the resurrection of, the evolution of today's Ukrainian culture. They're really back into Cossacks in a really big way, which is, we'll get into that later when we get into the Ukraine thing, but
When was that painted?
painted
Yeah.
19th century, Ilya Repin,
Okay.
1870, something like
Okay,
that. And he's absolutely the best painter ever in modern Russian history. And you'll see more of his stuff later.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are now not going to talk languages anymore. Back to history. So in 1015, Vladimir dies and his son takes over, Yaroslav. And he's called the Wise because he's really wise. So he becomes the Grand Prince of Kiev and Novgorod. Now, Novgorod, we haven't really talked about, but Novgorod is the other major city of the Kievan Rus, in partnership with Kiev. And Yaroslav carries on the work of his father and creates, but they're still frantically translating Greek texts, and not just liturgical church stuff, but Greek science and Greek philosophy. And just imagine, overnight, you go from an illiterate pagan society to having books en masse translated from Greek into your new language, that everybody is, by order and decree, must become literate and learn how to read all this stuff. It's the law, and the education that goes with it. So Yaroslav, for example, builds this school, literary school. Now remember, we're talking about the 11th century here, okay? Long time ago. And it's called the St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev. It's still there, and I hope to hell that a cruise missile never finds this place, because it's right there in the middle of Kiev. This is the kind of stuff that really sends chills down your spine. But this is an example of the first real mass sort of education library that's being created by Yaroslav. And he's got a whole bunch of folks from the Byzantines up there, again, translating Greek texts into the new Russian Cyrillic. Again, politically, this guy does something that no one's ever even thought of doing yet in this part of the world, which is he marries one daughter off to the King of France, another one Norway, another one Hungary. This adds gigantic legitimacy to this Kievan Rus idea, right? Politically. And he compiles the first book of laws. It's called the Russian Justice, written down. And it's, I don't know, centuries, as far as I can tell, ahead of its time. And I just picked two features of the law that he creates and writes down. And one, which is really interesting and kind of the cornerstones of most rules of law, is how do property rights work. And he's kind of one of the first to ever describe how land ownership and property rights and what happens if somebody cuts a tree down on your property. That's all encoded in this new Russian justice thing. And even more remarkable, he is as much concerned about the rights of the accused as the victims in a crime. So in a criminal matter, he is meting out, this idea of justice where the accused has rights. Has anybody yet in Europe done this? I don't know. I don't know. This is way before the Magna Carta. It's way before. I don't know. But remember, we're talking about the foundational birth story of Russia, and it's already basically a republic, a more direct democracy that's going to get going here.
But it's in what we think of as Ukraine.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Because Moscow, by the way, is right here, and it's just a little cow town at this point, right? It's a little village. The action is in Kiev and Novgorod, which is, we'll get into Novgorod next.
I think the Magna Carta was about them.
Well, it was 12 something, 1275, something like that. Yeah. Oh, yeah, and just one more thing, just one of these little things that tell you a lot about the old days and the new days. So both Russia, modern Russia, and Ukraine claim Yaroslav as their own, as the legitimate heir. I mean, the question is, who's the legitimate heir to the legacy of the Kievan Rus? And he's such an important figure in the development of both countries that if you looked at, this is a banknote from Ukraine, I don't know, 50, I forget what they call their currency, starts with a G, I can't remember right now. But that's a banknote today, right now, in Ukraine, money. And this is a banknote in rubles in Russia. And this is just one of these little things with these two civilizations keep poking at each other. So Yaroslav on the Ukrainian bill looks like a Cossack. He's got the big mustache, he's dressed up like a Cossack. And the same guy, Yaroslav the Wise, on the ruble in Russia is dressed up like a czar. In fact, he looks just like Ivan the Terrible. He's got a beard, he's got this big staff, and he's a czar. And it's just one of these little nits of cultural tension between these two civilizations. And every once in a while, some little thing like this will pop up and say, wow, this tug of war between who even owns the heresy, the Kievan Rus, is just a tug of war back and forth. So anyway, it just says a lot, though, even a little thing, I think. Okay, so we haven't talked about Novgorod. Remember, Novgorod, right? We've been talking primarily about Kiev. Well, these guys are, grand princes of Kiev. But Novgorod is all part of the Rus. And we're moving ahead now. We're in the 12th and 13th centuries. And Lord Novgorod the Great sounds like a person. It's not a person, it's the name of the city. That's how much they think of this city. Lord Novgorod the Great is the city of Novgorod. And it is, again, I hate to keep going back and forth like this. I should have had a different map. Well, wait, let me see. So this is like a 12th century look at the lay of the land. And here's Kiev, here's Moscow, and here's Novgorod. And the thing about Novgorod is everybody here is landlocked. Nobody in the Kievan Rus has access to a sea or an ocean or can get out. It's landlocked. Novgorod is on the Gulf of Denmark, the Gulf of Finland, which gets you out to the Baltic Sea, which gets you to the Atlantic, it gets you to Great Britain, it gets you to Europe. And these guys, because of their ability to have a route out to the sea where nobody else does, they're rich. These are merchants. They are selling. This is all forest country. This is all open steppe prairie. Think of that down here. But up here it's forest. So Novgorod is selling massive amounts of furs to the Europeans. And they're just really rich merchants because they've got this trading route that nobody's got.
Were they, it said in your previous slide that they traded with France.
Yeah.
And did they go through a water passage at that time
Yeah.
in France? As
Yeah,
opposed
because
to
that's right.
overland?
Yeah, sure.
because of the
I
water,
mean,
yeah.
what is now Germany and France, all that's accessible from the Baltic Sea. I mean, the Denmark, the Scandinavia. I mean, it's,
So they had
they
access.
had
Western
access.
Europe.
But Kiev's down in the middle of Eurasia, and there's no. But again, the theme of landlocked versus not landlocked becomes a huge thing as we go through this.
Yeah.
So this is a very rich culture, and I'm sorry, go. I got one more thing I want you to observe here on this map is what's with all these separate little things going on. Here's Kiev. The previous map showed all of this is kind of one thing, united. Remember, and Vladimir kind of united all these Slavic tribes. But now, that was the 11th century. Now we're into the 12th, 13th century. And bad things are happening now on the Kiev side of things. it's called appanage in the history books. It's the phenomenon where a prince has 3 sons and he carves up land, so each of the 3 sons gets a piece, and they become a mini prince of their little world. And then they have kids, and pretty soon this united principality becomes a hereditarily fragmented. And again, the brothers fight, you know, you can imagine it's political fragmentation. It's not good. And it's starting to, you know, split up the old Kievan Rus managed out of Kiev and all these little things. And Kiev and Moscow now has its own little principality where it didn't used to. And it weakens the whole notion of Kiev's rule over all this. This is not happening in Novgorod. Novgorod is still, well, again, they're rich and they're merchants and all that. So does all that make kind of sense? Yeah, okay. So Novgorod's growing stronger and richer. Kiev is now weakening because of this political kind of dynasty fragmentation thing. And pretty soon, Novgorod starts throwing their weight around. It used to be in the beginning of all this, Kiev would appoint the Prince of Novgorod. Now Novgorod's saying, we'll just do our own thing. We don't want your prince. Kiev's too weak to argue about it. And they even established their own head of the Russian Orthodox Church, which used to be kind of in the center of was Kiev. But again, Kiev is just, you know, they're getting pushed around by Novgorod. So, and however, all these countries, particularly Novgorod, is being attacked relentlessly by the Germans, the Finns, the Swedes, and the Lithuanians. And there's this one, still, he's the most heroic figure of anything to do with Russian history. His name is Alexander Nevsky. Anybody heard that? If you studied any of this, it's this, you know, heroic name, this heroic person. Of course, I got a picture of him. You know, who knows, right? But and he is doing something really important, which is he is pushing, you know, he's preventing any of these invaders, Germans, Finns, Swedes, or Lithuanians, from attacking and somehow taking over Novgorod. And they can't. Now, had they been able to, remember, these countries are Roman Catholic. Novgorod and the rest of Kiev is Eastern Orthodox. So it's very likely that had these attackers actually defeated Novgorod and occupied it, they would have almost certainly forced converted this early Russian state into Roman Catholicism. And you try to imagine how this story would be different as we go through it if the Eastern Orthodox foundations of Kievan Rus and even now we're going to be able to call it Russia, had been converted to Roman Catholicism. I don't know where that goes, but it didn't happen is the point. And we're going to talk about the Mongol invasion for a second, but here's the thing about how the Novgorod government formed itself. So they always had a prince. Principalities have princes that are monarchs in some way. Well, if there's one thing that really rich merchants hate is government intrusion until the business, right? We got business to do. I got business to do with Great Britain. I got business to do with the French. And if you've got some prince who's like doing princely stuff, they're just getting in the way. And you don't want to get in the way of these rich guys. So they depose the prince. They don't do anything to him. They just defang. He has no power. He's probably got a better set of teeth than everybody, but he's deposed, right? He's just another guy with a vote. But they create this thing called the Vetch, which is a town council. And here's sort of an artist's rendition of what this Vetch is. And it's the middle of the city of Novgorod, and it's the place where everybody meets, this grand council. And there's this thing called the Vetch bell, which anybody can ring the bell and convene the town council. And there's a mayor and a military leader. They're elected. and they can be fired. Remember, there's no prince. And big things are decided around that bell. War and peace, taxes, laws of all kinds. And anybody can convene this thing. Everything from some official, typical, or member of the church could. But Novgorod is divided into very interesting, different kinds of neighborhoods. And a neighbor who could have a grievance, ring the bell, and say, you know, sewage is really in bad shape here. We need to fix that, or whatever, right? And a single person can ring the bell and it convene this. And this is direct democracy, right? This is, there is no nobility that runs this. There, you know, commoners can be elected mayor. I mean, not just princely people, but if you've got the votes, you got the votes. And the problem with direct democracy, and we could probably relate to this, is, and their version of it, early version of it was, the only way to actually reach consensus or reach agreement on any topic brought to the bench was total unanimity. There is no mediator that says, okay, I've heard everybody's point of view and we're going to do this. And everybody says, okay, at least I got to say my piece. We're going to do it, right? They would endlessly work on a project, an agreement, because if it wasn't unanimous, you couldn't act. And I mean 100% unanimous. And that's messy and slow, and people are getting pissed off because you're not, you know, it's a little too direct because there's no prince or any other governing person that can, you know, break a tie or something. And the judicial system is, again, takes another big leap forward where they create this idea of juries for dealing with civil and criminal problems, legal problems. There's 10 jurymen, and they relied greatly on mediation, the way we try to do. And they are very reluctant to execute people. They, like in most cultures, thieves get their hands chopped off or something. Remember, 12th century? And the most amazing thing of all is this entire system is gender neutral. Women can do anything men can do. Ring the bell, vote, anything. Total gender and equality. I think that's remarkable, right, for such a time. Right?
Because the Eastern Orthodox Church was not.
No, absolutely not. But remember, they got their own head of their, you know, the church is going to, over time now, gradually lose. Well, it lost a lot of clout in this part of the early Russia. It's going to get it all back later. But right here, yeah, the church is just another voice in the bench. That's it. So this is one hell of an amazing story, cultural story. And if you think about Russia, you know, throughout history with czars and Putins and communists, to think that the origin story for like 400 years was direct democracy and a really smart advanced judicial system and gender and all kinds of inequalities that, you know, just remarkable that was formed at that time. So I
Was
thought,
that before they made vodka?
no. No, remember when they looked at the Islam and said, "What do you mean we can't drink? Are you crazy?" I don't know if it was vodka, but it was obviously in the family. Okay, and by the way, this is Novgorod today. That doesn't render well. This is the old city, and this is the new modern Novgorod. Okay, so that's Novgorod's story. Now, this is where things get really tragic, I think. So, 1294, the Mongolian horde arrives. Genghis Khan and they from Mongolia, and they are invading all of this territory to their west. And Genghis Khan's grandson, named Batu, his assignment was to conquer everything we're talking about, Russia, and get as much into Europe as possible with the Mongol invasion. And they got as far as what we call Austria today, which is kind of an amazing thing if you think they started here. So this is taken from some chronicle at the time from the city of Ryazan, which is kind of, it's geographically kind of between Moscow and in Novgorod, a little east of those cities. But this is just, you can read it. But when the Mongols showed up at your city walls, you had two choices the Mongols would give you. Don't resist us, don't fight us, don't, we will let you live, but you have to pay tribute to us. You have to pay taxes to us. If you do that, we won't sack your city and enslave your population, but you got to pay. If you decide to fight, they sack your city and massacre your people and enslave whoever who survives that. Obviously, this city, Ryazan, chose to fight, and they burned the city to the ground and kill everybody. And they don't kill everybody because they make a lot of money off of slavery. So a whole bunch of those people that become slaves. But this is, this is what's happening. And worse, of course. Well, again, if you think about this, Genghis Khan started this from Mongolia, and his first project was China, and 100,000 Mongolian warriors conquered 100 million Chinese. I mean, I can't get those numbers. It's kind of an amazing thing how they could conquer that, but they did. And again, Genghis Khan's grandson Batu goes to what we call Russia and Europe with 200,000 warriors. And he defeats Russia and Kiev through a winter campaign, which is interesting because Napoleon tried a winter campaign to Russia, destroyed his army. Hitler just tried a winter campaign to take over the Soviet Union, destroyed his army in the winter. But no problem for the Mongols. So they rode the frozen rivers, pretty cool. Kiev falls to the Mongols in 1240. Kiev fights and there is no more Kiev. Burnt again, they burned it down. And worse, if there's anything worse, they occupy pretty much everything we just talked about, Kiev and Rus, for 250 years. That's how long they occupied these lands, right? Now, that's as long as we've been a country, right? Pretty much. And the Mongols, so now, but however, the Mongols never got quite as far as Novgorod. So these are sort of, this is the area that the Mongol invasion occupied and basically destroyed. These areas are basically under control of the Mongols, but these principalities agree to the tribute. Therefore, they don't get burned down and enslaved. And in fact, the folks in Moscow become active collaborators with the Mongols.
Kiev on there is not in the area that was,
Well, they would be. This is,
yeah,
yeah.
okay.
But notice that Novgorod is not ever, they just never got that far north. And yet, even though they got awful close, so Novgorod, that guy Alexander Nevsky, we talked about a minute ago, he proactively reached out to the Mongols and said, I'll pay your tribute, just leave us alone. And they did. They didn't occupy him. The trading, everything in Novgorod merrily goes on, although now Kiev is no more. And everything in this space is now occupied for 250 years. So, this means that for 200 years, Russia, except for Novgorod, that town, is cut off from the West completely. They're cut off from Byzantium, their home base in Constantinople. They're completely cut off from things like the Renaissance. I mean, a lot of things are happening as Europe is advancing during that time up to about 1480, but not the Russians. They're isolated. They have no idea what's going on anywhere, especially in their most important place, which was Constantinople and the seat of the religion and everything else. That's what 250 years of occupation do. And so all of these great things we talked about in the Kievan Rus are pretty much destroyed except for Novgorod, which is tragic. And just to put a stake in the heart of this Kievan Rus culture, the Ottoman Turks conquer Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire in 1453. And that's how that place you visited, I can never say it. How do you say it? Yeah, whatever. That beautiful thing became a mosque. Now it's the seat of big Islamic overnight, right? So even the foundational place of Kievan Rus is now in Ottoman Turk Islamic control. I mean, what else can go wrong here, right? So, and a whole bunch of the scholars and Byzantine Empire artists and everybody, they all take off for, say, Italy, become part of the Renaissance. So this is just one of these catastrophic historical events that changed the entire trajectory of what we call the early Russian story, right? Never recovers from this. So remember on that map, Moscow wasn't burned down, and worse or better, depending on how you think about this, they don't just pay tribute to the Mongols, they collaborate with them. They help them. And they help them in a way where Moscow starts to exert control over other principalities around Moscow. Moscow is getting bigger. Kiev's destroyed. Moscow is getting bigger, and they are the beginnings of the autocratic Russian state that is going to predominate from now until we get out of here. And Ivan III is the Prince of Moscow. And the names of these guys is going to get real important. So Prince of Moscow, right? So he was like Yaroslav, Prince of Kiev or Prince of Novgorod. He's just the prince of this. It's called the Duchy of Moscow. But he's unbothered by the Mongols, and he starts to put in place very autocratic functions. Like even in kingdoms, kings had to worry about like the nobility, because the king would give you 1,000 acres of land, but in return there was a power sharing thing. In return, nobles would express loyalty to the king, and but in this and the nobility, the word for nobility in Russian is boyar, but it's the same thing. The rich landowners. And Ivan doesn't want to share power with anybody. He's, again, the first autocrat, and one of the first things he does is strip his nobility of any political influence over him. In return, he gives them these gigantic land grants. Some of them go almost down to what we call Ukraine today. But the most important thing that happens right here is here. So what the deal he cuts with his nobles for relinquishing their political power and letting him run everything is he gives them the land, and he agrees to enforce an idea where the peasants who work that land are bound to that land and can't leave. That's the beginning of serfdom. You're a serf. I mean, the difference between a slave in America, where slaves are imported from other places like Africa, but slaves in America are property and they can be bought and sold amongst plantation, you know, that whole system. This is the seed planted in the ground that starts serfdom when a serf can no longer, and his kids and his grandkids, they are bound to that piece of property. Even if the landowners change, somebody else buys it or dies or something. If you're a peasant and you're under this system, you can never leave, ever. And your kids can't. You're bound to that village, that piece of land. We never in slavery here, we never had that idea.
So does that serfdom go all the way through Tolstoy's time?
Yeah, and that's going to be absolutely the theme that destroys the Russian Empire, is never dealing with serfdom. So you're right on. Now, just as a kind of one of those cool little facts that I found the other day, but I thought it was cool, so you're going to see it, is so Ivan, he's trying to create, I mean, you know, this new really powerful principality that pretty soon is going to get much bigger than that. And he needs a proper fortress around the city. But the Russians of the day, when they build cities and stuff, it's mainly made out of wood. They don't know how to build things like the Kremlin. So Ivan III goes to Italy and he hires Italy's best architects and engineers and tells them to build what we now know as the Kremlin. And inside of there, Vladimir Putin is hiding someplace. But the Italians have all the engineering and technicals. If you saw a similar structure in Verona, Italy, it would look exactly the same way as the Kremlin, because the same Italians designed and built the thing. But the other thing that this guy is the designer Italian that built the Kremlin. But there was other Italians that came along the right, which were gunsmiths. At the time, the Italians were the best cannon makers in Europe and gunsmiths. So they teach Ivan's folks how to build big weapons, big cannons and stuff, which is going to come in real handy. But I just thought it was cool that the Italians did all this. I mean, I'm half Italian. So. Okay, so this trend now, we have another big event in 1478. Ivan getting stronger, accumulating more principalities around him. He's got the Mongols backing him up. He annexes Novgorod into the into the Moscow Principality. And there's really nothing that Novgorod can do about it. They're not strong enough to resist it. He's getting, really powerful. And this is the first time historians usually say the word Russia now can be used instead of the Duchy of Moscow or whatever. It's now the birth date of the state of Russia, the state we think of today as Russia. So from now on, we're going to talk about Russia. And that really wasn't okay to say until Moscow absorbed Novgorod into its principality. So at the same time, the Mongols are getting weaker, they're breaking up, they're starting to head back home. Ivan puts an army in the field and actually defeats the Golden Horde, and any claim that the Mongols had over Russia. So now he's no longer just the Grand Prince of Moscow. He is now the ruler of Russia, and he adopts the term Tsar as his own, which is derived from the Roman word Caesar. That's where Tsar comes from. Every Roman Empire, emperor was called Caesar, right? Well, that suits Ivan just fine. So he is now declared the Tsar, and he also coins the term autocrat, which is Greek for I run everything. 1505, Ivan dies, his son Vasily assumes the throne. And just as a flashback here, let's talk about religion again. So in 1054, you might recall that the huge schism between the Roman Catholic Church in Rome was split off to be the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople. Remember that? And that's where Christianity split into those two Western and Eastern pieces. And then the other big event here is, of course, when we just talked about, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, ending Constantinople as the seat of Eastern Christianity. It's Muslim now. So remember, Eastern Orthodox people consider Catholicism a huge heresy and betrayal of Christianity. Everything about how the culture of the Eastern Orthodox Church works is in direct conflict with the papacy in Rome and the strict hierarchy of Rome and the very political nature of Roman Catholicism. So anyway, the monk sends, this is a letter, but it's stuck to this very day. He sends this letter to Vasily, and this is what he says in the letter. All Christian kingdoms have come to an end. Two Romes have fallen. The one in Rome, because it went Catholic, that's not Christianity. And the other one, Constantinople, it fell to the Turks. A third stands, and there will not be a fourth. No one will replace Christian czardom. So now, Vasily and all his heirs can claim that Moscow, and therefore Russia, is the protectorate of Christianity, not Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but Christianity full stop. Because remember, that Roman version, Catholicism, that ain't Christianity. Certainly not to an Orthodox Easterner. It's completely anathema to it. So now the term Third Rome appears, right? And Russia can now claim to be the Third Rome, the seat of all Christianity. That's a big deal, right? So the heir to Ivan III is Ivan IV, and he earned the term Ivan the Terrible. You must have heard of Ivan the Terrible at some point. He takes over 1565. And remember up here, Novgorod was annexed by his father, or his grandfather, I mean. But the Novgorods were annexed, but that didn't mean they liked it. They were just a thorn in the side of the Ivans and the Tsars. And so finally, Ivan the Terrible, being Ivan the Terrible, sacks Novgorod and finally just kills Novgorod off, kills 60,000 people in the city and enslaves the rest. And now all that amazing democracy and everything we talked about in Novgorod is now gone, replaced by autocracy on steroids here. Autocracy that makes European autocracy look like child's play. And just to show something here that I think is just absolutely mind-blowing is at the same time Ivan the Terrible is sacking Novgorod, the Pope in Rome, the original Rome, sends a papal envoy to kind of check up on what the hell's going on in this Russia thing. Because, if you're in the Pope in Rome and you're watching, the Eastern Orthodox Church kind of get, burned down by the Turks, and then all of a sudden the Russians are claiming Christianity, he sends a papal envoy. The papal envoy comes back to the Pope after visiting Moscow and Ivan, and this is what he says, and it's amazing. It's, no one can really say what belongs to him in this country. Every man, whether he wishes or not, exists in a state of dependency upon the Tsar. The more a person has, the more he recognizes this dependency. The richer, the more he's afraid, for the Tsar often takes back everything he has given. Because unlike even, monarchies in Europe, where there's a semblance of property rights and things, there is absolutely zero notions of property rights anymore. That was destroyed when they burned down Novgorod. So the Tsar can give you an estate. The next day, if you do anything to piss him off, he'll take it back. I mean, everybody is dependent on the one man, the Tsar. And this is a rendering. Well, before I go to that, if you were to ask me, well, how would you change the words in that paragraph if we were talking about Russia today, the Russian Federation today? Well, the reality is you wouldn't change one word if under Vladimir Putin. Every single thing in there, just say Putin instead of Tsar, and I wouldn't change a word of it. So literally, it's, the same guy, the same thing. There is no difference. And Putin even likes to refer to himself as a Tsar. And there's 100 books that you could buy on Amazon that say, Vladimir Putin, the new Tsar. And that's what he wants you to think. And call them oligarchs, call them whatever you want. Putin can give you that $300 million yacht, or he can take it back, or he can send you to prison, or he can kill you, or he can give you more money, or he can. I'm just saying, boy, nothing changes in this Russian story from here on out about how these things work. But the other thing is what happens next. This is like this painting by the same guy who painted the Zaporozhian Cossacks, that painting, remember that one? Painted this too, and this is, Ivan was a psychotic, paranoid, crazy man. And he gets in a big argument with his son and only heir, and picks up a big staff and kills his son and only heir. And that, led to a big problem. Now now the succession, who's going to take over now after Ivan the Terrible's gone? Well, oops. It leads to, and you could spend hours on this one, but because there's no heir, it leads to this big chunk of time called the Time of Troubles, where there's no heir, nobody knows who's Tsar, who's running the show, and all hell breaks loose. Peasants start big uprising in the peasants. Foreign intervention, pretenders to the throne, all hell breaks loose. Because now they don't have, and by the way, Ivan the Terrible's bloodline goes back to Vladimir, the Rurik Viking bloodline that we started with at the very beginning of this thing. That bloodline goes all the way to Ivan the Terrible and his son, but he killed his son. So now that Rurik bloodline that started in the 10th century is now interrupted. There is no more bloodline. So the nobles finally, after all this chaos going on, they finally, say, we got to fix this. The whole place is falling apart. We need a Tsar. So they find the guy named Michael Romanov, and they elect him as the next Tsar in 1613. The Romanov is now the new dynasty, and Romanovs now become Tsars all the way till Nicholas II, who him and his family are murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1917 with the Communist Revolution. Right? He was a Romanov, and all Tsars between here and there are Romanovs. Right? So now I'm just saying we've got a whole new monarchic dynasty in the works here. But that's not the interesting part. Now, so we're going to spend a little more time on the next Tsar, who's a Romanov. He's part of that line now. You've all heard of Peter the Great, right? I mean, he's just this giant of Russian history, probably the giant of Russian history. He is 7 feet tall. Everybody thought, yeah, right. He's just short of 7 feet tall, which is just, okay, it's rare. And every Russian history book you ever want to read describes him the same way. He's just this dynamo of energy. Curious, determined. He's totally into things like mathematics, and he's totally obsessed with two things. He looks at his empire that he just inherited, and what does he see? He sees a landlocked empire. What's the point of having an empire if no part of it can reach the ocean? Right? We still don't have a way out, right? Because remember, Novgorod had a way out to the Baltic Sea. Well, the Swedes took that over, and now Russia's just a landlocked country. You cannot compete in the world of the 17th century if you're a landlocked country. I don't care how big you are. So on Peter's punch list, number one thing, we need to be a maritime country. We need a port. I got to be able to get to the ocean. And he's obsessed with building ships. He builds one himself. This tells you a lot about this guy. The same year he's actually anointed as Tsar, Peter the Great, he goes up to, he builds a shipyard, and all by himself, he builds this big ship. Because he's just obsessed with naval things and shipbuilding and getting out to the ocean. The other big thing, in his mind, he's got access. He knows about what's going on in Western Europe, right? I mean, Isaac Newton was alive at this time, right? I mean, some really amazing scientific rational. I mean, Age of Reason is going to start. All kinds of really interesting philosophical things are happening in in Western Europe, and they're big, powerful empires. And what is Peter got? He's got a 100% agrarian country, no industry, just land and serfs beholding to their landowners, and that's it. And so to him, Russia is backwards, 200 years behind, and they are 200 years at least behind. Remember, the Mongols occupied it for 200 years. So he's got two big things on his punch list. Get a port somewhere from somebody and have a crash course effort to bring Russia up to modern European standards, military, industrial, anything, your economy, bureaucracy, everything. So he reaches out, obsessed with bringing Europeans in to bootstrap him up to the 17th century, because he's stuck in the 14th century. And the other thing interesting about him, I mean, there's pictures like this of him, the typical monarch painting that you always see. This is not how Peter hates this shit. Peter is completely not interested and offended by all the intrigues of the Russian court, right? He has all that crap. He just wants nothing to do. He wants to build ships. And so he gets intimately involved in reforming all the affairs of state and how bureaucracy works. But he never goes to the court. He never puts on fancy clothes. He's working somewhere, with construction workers, learning stuff. So how does he get a port so they're not landlocked anymore? First thing he does, the next year, after he's become Tsar, he looks at the map and he says, well, we've already got a pretty big presence down in what we would call Ukraine, central Russia. And the only way out, if you want to not be landlocked anymore, is you get out through the Black Sea, you get into the Mediterranean, and you're out, right? The problem is Russia has this is all controlled by the Ottoman Turks. And Russia can't, so he starts a war with the Ottoman Turks. And, he does pretty good, and he builds this navy in like one winter. He builds, I don't know, all these ships that Russia had no ships like this, but he builds them. He's like really into that. And he comes down the Don, the major river here in the central Russia, and engages the Turks here, and he beats them, and he is now in charge of the Sea of Azov, which is right here. But that's as far as he gets. And the Turks still control the Black Sea. So Peter has a port with nowhere to go because he can't, and it will take Catherine the Great later to defeat the Turks to the point where the access to the sea is established. Peter couldn't do it, but Catherine, who's going to come next, did it. Okay, so, and he's doing this kind of stuff all the time, right? So he's got his foot in the door, right? In terms of getting after the oceans. And he's sending all kinds of his best people to places like Holland, Italy, England to learn how to do navigation, let's say he gets access to the ocean. They don't know how to sail they don't know how to navigate on water. They don't know any of this stuff. But England and everybody else in the West, obviously they've been doing this for a long time. So again, this is typical of Peter. He's crash course, send a bunch of people to places like Holland, Italy, and England, and learn how to do it and bring it back home. So he travels to Amsterdam incognito, right? He hates being talked about as a czar. He hates dressing up like a czar. So he roams around looking like this. And he gets this group of people around him to go to Amsterdam, which was the best place where the experts of shipbuilding lived. And he goes totally incognito. The idea is nobody knows he's the czar. My problem with that story is he's 7 feet tall. It's like, you may look like that, but aren't you the guy that? So there's a kink in the history there about incognito. How do you be incognito when he's 7 feet tall? Anyway, and actually there's in Amsterdam, there's that statue to him in the dockyards building ships, learning how to build ships. So he's totally bought into adopting and learning and bringing back to Russia as much expertise in as many disciplines from Europe as he possibly can. He even goes to England, the Greenwich Observatory. He meets with people like Isaac Newton. In the meantime, back in Moscow, the nobility, everybody except Peter, hates everything that's going on here, right? They don't want to adopt, they're not Europeans. They don't want to adopt European culture and philosophy and mathematics. That is so alien to the Russian mind at the time, who are still locked in Orthodox Christianity and systems of running the bureaucracy that go back hundreds of centuries. And so they're totally getting in his way. And so Peter, being Peter, pretty much just steamrolls over all of them and takes all the power away. And he creates really this huge autocracy in his own right of centralized state control over everything. Because he does not have the time or the patience to negotiate anything with the old guard in Moscow. So, and he completely, devalues the Russian Orthodox Church. Remember, all throughout this time, church and state is one thing, right? The church is basically just a ministry of a ministry. It's part of the state. It's not a separate thing the way we think about church and state at all. So the state grants land to the church, pays for all the salaries of the priests and their families. Peter, again, the church is just an obstacle. He doesn't care a whit about that. So he takes back huge amounts of church land. He dramatically reduces the stipend going to the priests and their families, impoverishes everybody regarding the church, in the church. All this is going to come back later around the guitar, not a good way, by the way. And he completely redoes the military. And he even, sorry, we have to have a little language interlude. Remember the Church Slavonic, the old Russian alphabet we looked at? One night, Peter can't sleep, goes to his desk, decides to completely reform the alphabet. Right, and this is in his hand. This is what he actually, with his own hand, did. So if you look at any of these letters in the previous, when we looked at the old Russian Cyrillic alphabet, like the M kind of looked this way. So he turns it into very Western looking letters, that are not, they're very, because he's trying to do trade with Europe. And nobody in Europe is going to understand all this Church Slavonic, this crazy stuff. So he makes it as a Western looking as he can. And by the way, in the old notion of the Cyrillic and that whole alphabet, they never had adopted Arabic numerals like the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is the number 1000 in Church Slavonic. Don't ask me to explain how that stuff turns into numbers and symbols, but that's the other thing he does, right? He adopts Arabic numerals, which had never been used in Russia before. How do you do business with anybody if you're saying, well, it's 100,000 somethings, and this is 100,000? It's like, I don't think so. So this is the first book that's published in his newfangled Westernized alphabet, much cleaner, and it's actually got Arabic numerals in it. Big deal. But this, and again, he's the Tsar, he can do anything he wants. He gets, gets up in the middle of the night and changes everything. And then say, okay, next morning, we're doing this now. Okay, Peter, got it. So he still hasn't got access to the sea. He is still landlocked. He's doing all this other Westernization stuff, but he's still, and remember, he's got that little foot in the door up and down the Black Sea, but he can't use it yet. So Poland, Denmark, and Russia get together, kind of independently, but they get together. And at the time, Sweden is this gigantic, powerful country, and they own the territory that Peter wants so he can get access to the Baltic Sea. So those three countries go to war against Sweden. And all Peter wants is the access to the Gulf of Finland, gets him out. And Poland and Denmark have other land they want to get from the Swedes. Well, at the time, Sweden has a really powerful army, and they crush Poland and Denmark's efforts. And then they move on to Russia, figuring, well, Russia, how hard could that be? But they don't know that Peter's been greatly modernizing the Russian Navy and Army. And Peter crushes the Swedish army and seizes the land, which finally gets him what he wants, which is this. This was all Swedish. Russia couldn't get there. So he beats the Swedes, and he now seizes this, puts a fort called the St. Peter, St. Paul Fortress. And now he has got what he's always wanted, remember obsession number 1, which is access out, and he's no longer landlocked anymore. Then he has another idea. He says, well, while I'm at it, one way to deal with this, all these old timers in Moscow that are resisting me at every turn, all these reforms I'm doing, he gets his engineers saying, we're going to build a city. Well, you saw it, St. Petersburg, right? And he builds it right there at the entrance to the Gulf of Finland. And not only does he create a naval shipyard and all the stuff you would think of there, but he decides this is going to be the new capital of Russia. Moscow will no longer be the capital of Russia. St. Petersburg will. And at the moment, it's just a swamp, right? With a fort on it. So they start building the city of St. Petersburg. He moves to it and demands that all the nobility that have had hereditary mansions in Moscow for generations, they all have to move to St. Petersburg too, which was that went over really well, right? So everybody has to relocate to this kind of Western crazy boomtown called St. Petersburg. And at the same time, when he wins that war, he acquires a huge part of what is now Ukraine as part of the Russian Empire. So now we're not talking about the Tsardom of Russia, we're talking about the Russian Empire from now on. And so Peter's just so important. We had to spend time on it because, and let's give him what's the report card here? He does finally get access to the sea. He does reform. He creates a lot of free enterprise. He creates industries that didn't exist before him. Textile industry, mining, glassmaking, all kinds of stuff. And now he's got foreign trade going like crazy. Education, he's setting up, academies of science that he's imported from Europe in navigation, mathematics and everything. And he completely changes how the bureaucracy works, gets rid of the whole hereditary privilege thing. And now commoners can be somebody in the state bureaucracy. But the cons are, he's spending money he doesn't have. The treasury is always empty. And so he does exactly the worst thing you can do, which is in order to get more money into the treasury, he puts the screws to the serfs and his new class of like workers, and they're paying heavier taxes. These are the most impoverished people in the country. But at the time, the population of Russia at the time was about 18 million souls in the whole empire. 93% of those people were serfs. Think about that number a minute. So, and instead of, if you're going to reform something, reform that, right? But he doesn't. He's too busy, hobnobbing with the Dutch and the shipbuilding and all that stuff. And now he's running out of money. He ran out of money a long time ago, but now he is putting the screws to the only people that you can. There's millions of them. Are the serfs and the working class. You can see where the communist revolution is in their future sometime, right? And because he's like so completely obsessed with all the rational the rational kinds of natural philosophy that's happening in Europe, secularization, emphasis on the individual, rational thinking, evidence, science, all of this stuff is grating against old believers of the old Orthodox Church, right? And so he creates the first real schism between everybody who's trying to westernize Russia with all the old believers and the old, that absolutely think that's heresy. You're creating another Roman Catholic heresy here. So, but one thing more, if you look at St. Petersburg today, oh my God, these pictures suck. I wish you could see what my computer says. The city of St. Petersburg today, I was there. Anybody been there? Isn't it kind of breathtaking?
Oh, yeah.
Especially
when you compare it to Moscow.
Yeah, Paris, Rome, but St. Petersburg is right there. It is absolutely stunningly beautiful. And it's like this city of bridges and
Clean.
Well, not when I was there, but yeah, it really needed a
Cleaner.
But see, he builds the Summer Palace. He went to France. He hung out with King of France, Louis. He saw Versailles. He comes back. He says, "Hey, that Versailles thing, I want one of those." Does he have the money to build this? Of course not. But he's whole hog now on doing these things. And one of the most interesting things was
Hermitage.
the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. It's bigger than the Louvre in Paris. The collection of old antiquities and paintings there is, depending, arguably as good or better than the Louvre in Paris, because he's acquired all this art and all this stuff from the West. But again, he's writing checks he can't cash it. But I don't know how that happened. Okay, hold on 1 second, guys. So we're almost done, I promise. So this is out of my original college Russian history textbook, this map. And this is all at the death of Peter the Great, all this diagonal stuff. And Catherine the Great, who's going to come next, expands the empire. And I put her here because she expands it into what most of the Ukraine today. She takes over Crimea, which Putin took away from the Ukrainians in 2014 again. It's the most strategic piece of military land on the planet, I think. And finally, she accomplishes what Peter couldn't. She gets access out because she defeats the Ottoman Turks. Now, Russia finally has two ways out to the oceans. St. Petersburg, and now through the Black Sea, which was always the goal. Anyway, and Catherine the Great did that.
St. Petersburg, a year-round open war.
Yep. There was another port called Archangel that you could get out, but it was iced over like 10 months a year. So, but yeah, St. Petersburg is the only one. Finally, and I promise we're almost done. And you're gonna like this quote because you like my quotes. De Tocqueville says, "The most perilous moment for a bad government in what tries to mend its ways." So let's talk for the last one, Alexander II, who is a reformer, and he emancipates me finally. Should have been done hundreds of years ago, but he emancipates the serfs at almost exactly the same time Abraham Lincoln emancipates our slaves. I mean, it's uncanny how they happen at the same time. But there's 40 million serfs. There's 8 million American slaves. And the thing that really pushed this over the edge was just early on in his reign, there were gigantic, 550, it depends how you count, violent peasant uprisings that, the peasants have finally had enough of this serfdom thing. So he reforms it. He has this very convoluted way to emancipate them. But this guy, Alexander II, he's a very wishy-washy kind of guy. He's not, people can talk him out of things. So his reforms are kind of half-assed and not very satisfactory. And he actually does a lot of judicial reforms too that we don't have to get into. But what's going on in Europe? French Revolution happened right earlier. And there's this growing group of radical revolutionaries that their goal is to pretty much upend every monarchy in Europe, including his. And he does reform things. You know how this works. Reformers not only piss off their conservative groups that don't want reform, he also completely alienates the radicals who thinks he didn't go far enough. I mean, this is the scourge of any reformer, right? You can never satisfy the old guard or the new radicals who want everything changed overnight. So they assassinate him in 1881. And it took 6 attempts to kill him, but the radicals their thinking was basically coming from Europe, because that's when Karl Marx is writing Das Kapital. That's when the beginnings of the Russian Revolution is really simmering. And it's one thing to say, I'm going to take in Voltaire and Descartes and all these great thinkers of Europe, but you're also going to get the radical revolutionaries who had the French king guillotine, chopped his head off, not that far before this. Right, so it's a double-edged sword. This reforming thing is very,
That's when Germany and Italy were created too.
yeah. And just to end this thing, so this again creates the tension, which is absolutely real today, between Westerners, the whole notion of Western rationalism marginalizes religion, embraces not only agnosticism, but atheism and nihilism kind of pops up, and radical socialism like Marx is popping up. In the meantime, the Slavophiles, who are the old guard, are still hanging on for dear life to orthodoxy. And this is sort of the essence of the difference between Catholicism, say, and just everything Western, and everything still very much Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. Eastern Church is not influenced by reason or logic, which is seen as the antithesis of faith. God is a matter of spirit, can't be found through the workings of the intellect. This goes right to the heart of the tension between the old and the new ways to, and there's nothing different about that than today. Remember this slide from the first session? That patriarch of Russian Orthodoxy, guy who runs the church in Moscow, has blessed Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It's the right thing to do. I bless it, which is the reason why millions of Russians aren't on the streets protesting this, because their church is telling them this is a good thing. We should do this to the Ukrainians. And he's out of his sermons, he preaches this notion of security and stability and the evils of gay rights and feminism and all the rest. And most importantly, he says things like Western freedoms and laws are fundamentally of no value because only the state can define what value means. Whatever, right? So this argument that killed Alexander II because the old Slavophiles, Putin is totally exploiting that. Putin is now the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Third Rome. And he's wrapping his entire czar's pitch of his own. He's wrapping himself in the robes of fundamental Orthodoxism, because all these reforms, I'll just pick gay rights as one of a million examples, in the West are heresy to the church and all the rest. This is Vladimir Putin speaking, and he's got a huge following of believers that believe that just like they did 300 years ago. I mean, so anyway, you can always tie this stuff back to, I'm done. I'm sorry, I'm done. But I hope we tried to do a lot here.
Great.
Let me just, one more thing here. Can we just go back to the beginning for one minute? Remember, we started by saying Vladimir the Great, 988 AD, established Byzantine Eastern Orthodoxy and propagated it to the entire Kievan Rus thing. Well, don't think for a minute that the Jesuits and Catholics weren't roaming around at the same time trying to convert people to Catholicism. And this is an excerpt out of that book, that Ukrainian book I started with. And I just found this last night, which I thought, it just told me something I'd never heard of about this. I'll just read it. Attempts by Jesuits to convert Kievan Rus people to Catholicism evoked great resistance. The elite of the threatened Orthodox Christians learned how to use the weapon of the Jesuits, education and books. The Rus community became the tribe, Slavic tribe, that began to read and even more so to write books. Involvement in the book culture became something of a distinguished Ukrainian Cossack feature, and not Russian. Ukrainian and Russian Cossacks became different precisely because Ukrainian Cossacks, those crazy guys with writing the letter, you know, the Zaporozhian guys, became a book reading tribe. Ukrainian Cossacks became the center of modern Ukrainian identity. And again, it's just one of the, that book is full of these, where he contrasts something that I couldn't find anywhere else about Jesuits, the battle between Catholicism and, you know, the way that they exploited, you know, books and reading to push their cause, and how only the Kievans, not the Russians, but the Ukrainians immediately pushed back on it and started writing their own books. And that's a cultural icon of today's Ukraine versus, it's a tidbit that book's full of these. And it tells you a lot about Ukrainian culture. So, I'm done. Thank you. Okay. I need a drink. You probably do too. And Maria, you know, next week, we're not going to do the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik thing. We're going to save that till the last one. Next week, we're going to do the demise of the Soviet Union, starting with the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, up until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That's next week. The last week, which is only about Ukrainian things only, is where we are going to start that story at the Russian Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, because the Ukrainian story about that event is probably more compelling than the Russian version of that. So
I might miss next week because I have a planning board meeting.
yeah.
That's why they just left.
Oh, yeah.
Disconnects very much.
Western freedoms caused themselves without spiritual depth,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, you agree with part of that. wouldn't you?
Yeah, he was. Yeah. He thinks we've lost our spiritual life,
Well, the first section.
becoming Western and rational
And materialistic.
and materialistic and individualistic and all that.
So he would say that spiritual depth of Russia, even though socialism failed,
Right.
but he would still say that's the great difference between the spiritual soul of Russia and our Western
Exactly.
culture and values, right?
That's what's so interesting about his take about the downside of Western
Freedoms.
freedoms. And he thinks did you read the thing?
I did.
I mean, I am so obsessed with that speech.
I am too. And you know, I was so glad that Peter Kreeft, if I'm pronouncing his name right.
Yeah, that's right.
He called him a prophet, and he was a prophet. And prophets are usually stoned. You know, they're not well received, but who do we have today that has that kind of a